Hello, RGL2100 students. Back to you for Lesson 11 on the role of the Regulatory Affairs Officer. As you know, we will be having our Zoom call this afternoon at our regular class time, which is 4 o'clock. Those Zoom calls are up to an hour, but they can take 5 minutes if students don't have questions. The best way to make use of those Zoom calls is come with your questions prepared, whether those be about your term paper or any other aspect of the course that you would like to raise with me during the Zoom calls. All right. If there's something personal, of course, you should email me and we can do a separate call or whatever. But if it's course material related, then by all means, let's raise them on the Zoom call, make use of the time. If there's no questions when we meet for the Zoom call, then it'll be a short Zoom call. If there's lots of questions, we can use up to an hour, okay? So that time is for you. That's like the replacement for office hours, if you will. All right, so be prepared to participate if you have questions, concerns, issues with respect to your papers or anything like that. All right, but for now, this will be the video lecture where we'll look over our Lesson 11 on the role of the Regulatory Affairs Officer. And it's important to recognize that many of you will, some of you will certainly work in government likely, but many of you, if you're international learners, will probably start your careers, but not necessarily, but probably start your careers in private sector positions. And this is where the role of the Regulatory Affairs Officer becomes a very important consideration for what would a job in regulatory affairs look like. As I've said to all of the class cohorts that have gone through this program in past years, one of the first things that you should recognize when you start a new position is that you may be handed a file, and that file may be quite narrow in terms of your roles and responsibilities. But a good regulatory affairs officer always tries to understand the full life cycle of the company, what it produces, how it produces it, how it ships it, where it gets its inputs, and so on, throughout the life cycle of a product, and finds out at what type of regulations apply to what stages in the product life cycle. By doing that, you become extremely knowledgeable about the organization and capable of doing your job at a higher level. So don't forget that concept of the life cycle of the product or service that your company provides, where it's regulated at various stages of the life cycle, and what responsibilities does the company have with respect to regulatory compliance at various stages of the life cycle and across various regulations that apply to the company's products or services. But that said, as a preamble, let's look at some of the things that a regulatory affairs officer can end up getting involved in. So there's really, as I've said before, there really is a strong relationship between the regulator and the regulatory affairs officer within a company. Whenever I talk to officials in government departments, I always raise this question. You know, how are things going out there in the community with regulatory affairs officers? And the regulators invariably jump to how important it is to continue to improve the regulatory affairs environment out there in companies, regardless of the sector they're in, pharma, agro, food security, industrial. It doesn't really matter. The point is they have a strong preference for strong regulatory affairs officers at the other end of the line, and for good reason. Regulatory affairs officers can exist under any number of different job titles, obviously. But the point is that many of their tasks remain the same regardless of the title. And as I say, the regulator and the regulatory affairs officer are both trying to manage a process within the law and in compliance with applicable regulations. So a notion of an assumption of teamwork is really important when you're a regulatory affairs officer. Not concealing, not trying to trick the regulator, not trying to cause anything to be underhanded or to allow your company to transgress regulations. All of those things are very important. And I say that because, you know, you might find yourself in a situation where, as a regulatory affairs officer, you're coming under pressure within a company to look the other way. It's your job as a regulatory affairs officer to know that's a short-sighted perspective. It's short-sighted, it's going to get the company in trouble eventually, and will likely get you in trouble. So that's never a good idea. So the regulatory affairs officer are crucial links between their company, its products and services, and the regulatory authorities. An effective relationship is absolutely key. It can serve to benefit the company in numerous ways. Giving the company the benefit of the doubt if there's an accident, giving the company more support if there's a need for a product recall. All of these things. Regulators are human beings. Regulatory institutions have memories. And if you perform a good, solid service for your company as a regulatory affairs officer, that can be a set of goodwill that can be traded on if you ever need it as a regulatory affairs person. And besides, when a regulation has been well developed and consulted, the regulatory affairs officer can be thought of as the regulatory enforcement officer within their own company. In fact, you will often find yourself walking the corridors to say, hey, I need this report. Or you might have attached to your responsibilities not only relationships with government regulations, but with the bylaws of the corporation itself, where you may be enforcing within the company that company people obey their own bylaws. So, often the regulatory affairs person is somebody that both needs to understand the full scope of the organization and understand that sometimes their job is in fact to ensure that people are in compliance within the bowels of their own organization. Now, obviously, that does not mean the regulatory affairs officer never represents their company. Of course they do. They're employees. But at the end of the day, taking a short-sighted perspective to bringing a company into compliance will end up costing more down the road. And regulators view regulatory affairs officers as a very important resource, because if there is a problem or if there is a concern, the regulator feels a lot better if they can pick up the phone and call an experienced regulatory affairs officer. Somebody who's got a record of being honest, being transparent. If there's a problem, being transparent about it, talking about the way the company is working to come into compliance. If there is a problem, is on time with all reports to the government, is basically a good performer. And if that happens, a company gets the benefit of the doubt with the regulator. I've seen it happen many, many times. When a company has a record of being a bad actor in compliance with regulation, their reports are late, or they have to be called to finish their reports, or any number of things like that, that's never going to serve you well if there ever is a situation where you need the cooperation of the regulator. Okay? Typical activities of regulatory affairs officer, are wide. Can be any number of different things. If you take a job with a small company, you might be chief cook and bottle washer. You might be doing all of their regulatory functions. If you join a larger organization, of course, there's going to be a much more elaborate division of labor, and you might be given a thin file, or one aspect of the regulatory or product and service life cycle that you're going to be focusing on is going to be your primary responsibility. But at the end of the day, both can be successful careers to start. You work with a small company, you're going to be working long hours, but you're going to learn a ton that can later be taken to jobs with larger organizations or into government or whatever the case may be. If you're working for a larger company, of course, my experience has been that whenever in all my years of traveling for business, I've sat down with executives because we were at the same UN meeting or something, or we're in the airport and I'm talking to people. It is amazing the amount of times I've heard people who are senior officials now within their companies who at one point in their career were in the regulatory affairs department or regulatory affairs branch. And that's where they learned a much broader grasp of the company and how it operates, because they were smart. They focused on the life cycle of the company. They understood it. And that made them valuable management employees because they have a broader grasp of the detail of the way the company works, which is an invaluable resource for any manager, as you can well imagine. So regulatory affairs officers can be asked to do a number of things: keeping abreast of international legislation, guidelines, and customer practices in all countries that the company is involved in or trading to. That can be a common issue. For example, if the company is exposed to regulatory requirements in various countries with respect to access for trade, the regulatory affairs person might be focused a lot on making sure the company is in consistent compliance across several jurisdictions. That can happen. That's typically, obviously, a larger company. Collecting, collating, and evaluating scientific data that has been researched by colleagues, because that data will be needed to report to government or to report to stakeholders, or doing your own internal analysis of any risk factors that may be emerging for the company, both vis-a-vis a government regulator and vis-a-vis civil liability. Developing and writing clear submissions and subsequent explanations for new product license and license renewals, obviously a major issue. Preparing submissions of license variations and renewals to strict deadlines that can substantially impact the firm's bottom line. Any delays in these types of things can have a major financial impact on a company. Any questions about the quality of these things can have a major impact on your employer's bottom line. Monitoring and setting timelines for license variation and renewal approvals. This can be a process of simply making sure that the company is doing all the things, and you're getting reports from all branches of a company, or whatever the case may be, in a timely manner. You can't ask for it the day before the license renewal application is required. You have to plan all of these things on a systematic calendar, probably annually. Because there can be different regulatory requirements arriving at different stages in the year, at different points in the year. Okay, writing clear, accessible product and service descriptions that are compliant with prevailing regulations or norms. You might get involved in preparing labels, ensuring compliance with shipments of products. Are they traveling with the safety data sheet? Are they all of these requirements that are required by one or another regulation? You might be involved in planning and developing product trials and interpreting trial data. That can be the case, particularly if you're working in the area of pharma. Advising scientists and manufacturers on regulatory requirements when they're designing new products or services. Typically the way the product design process works is that very early in the stage, the company is making solid decisions about what products to use as inputs, what product design characteristics would a product need to be in compliance with regulation, so on and so forth. So sometimes regulators work closely with product and service design personnel to make sure that whatever they're designing not only looks good, but also is in full compliance with regulatory requirements. Providing strategic advice to senior management throughout the development of new product or service in areas subject to regulation, current or pending. You might discover something on your job and have to say to your employer, hey, there's a problem here. This may get us into trouble down the road if we don't account for it now. And, there's a saying that goes that 80% of the characteristics of a product are set at the design stage. And that's why regulatory people need to be involved early in the design, because once the design is approved and we go out to retooling of factories or retooling of production cycles or whatever the requirement is for the new product, once you commit to that, you've basically embedded about 80% of the characteristics of that product. Changes are much more difficult to make at that point. So often regulatory affairs people need to be involved early in the product cycle of a company as well. And regulatory affairs officers can also be called on to manage teams of colleagues involved with the development of new products, undertake and manage regulatory inspections. Regulator comes to the company. The person's not going to be walking around the plant by themselves. They're usually with one of the regulatory affairs people of the company, and that regulatory affairs person has already sort of made a bunch of calls so that the operations manager is there when they arrive, or whoever is required to be on hand for the regulatory visit. Okay, so those kinds of things are all required. Review company practices and provide advice on changing regulatory compliance systems. Sometimes you might get a job with a company where their regulatory compliance systems are not properly automated yet, not properly integrated. People are talking past each other. They're not working together. Reports are arriving at the wrong time. They're arriving with very wildly variable levels of quality. Any number of different things can arise where you might spend a good chunk of time just coordinating the regulatory compliance function within your organization. Liaising with regulatory authorities is a common aspect of the job. You might have to call the one window of delivery to sort of ask a question. Say, I'm not really understanding how this is working, or whatever. So that's why a good relationship with the regulator is really important. You might also find yourself in a situation where your company has fallen out of compliance. that compliance failure has now appeared in the newspaper, or as a constituent has written to an MP, and the MP has written to the minister, and the minister then sends a letter to your company, or whatever the case may be. You know, you may find yourself in a situation where you're now sitting down with the regulator to negotiate how the company will come into compliance, and how the next time anything happens, it won't be via the letter to the MP route, but how you will communicate more effectively with the regulator, and vice versa. So problem solving can be a very important aspect of, obviously a very important aspect of a regulatory affairs person's job, because a regulatory affairs job is primarily about keeping the company out of problems with respect to regulatory compliance. That's your job, and so that sometimes means that, oops, we made a mistake. Accidents happen in industry, for example, right? I mean, accidents happen. I mean, you can deploy a lot of best practices for regulatory compliance, and accidents can still happen. Cars aren't meant to bump into each other on the street, but they do. And the same thing can apply to regulation. Things happen. And the regulatory affairs person needs to be very knowledgeable, to mobilize quickly, to respond to the problem, both by bringing the company back into compliance and by making sure that the relationship with the regulator is positive, or the relationship with outside stakeholders is positive. And one of the best ways to do that is to be upfront. Yeah, okay, accidents were made. Here are the steps we're taking to bring the company back into full compliance. Okay? So these are all very important functions of a regulatory affairs person, and it can be a very interesting job, particularly if you're working on international files, or if you're working on a startup where you decide that you're going to put in the hours for the first couple of years, and then if the company starts to take off, it may pay off for you very, very handsomely. In other cases, you've just learned a lot and then you've moved on. So I encourage you to, sort of look at your first regulatory affairs job as that first step, getting that work experience. Try to practice the things you're being taught about when you take a company. Don't just take the file and say, okay, boss, this is all I'm going to do. Learn the company. Analyze the company's product life cycle. Analyze where the company is being regulated at various stages of the product life cycle. Build your knowledge base, because every time you work as a regulatory affairs person in a company, you build your knowledge base. That's just a huge resource you take to whatever future job you do, or to whatever promotion you do within the existing company. All right? So these are really important things. It's important sometimes, when we get buried in the detail of our program, people forget to talk about, well, what is it that I'll be doing, and why is it interesting? Why is it exciting? And I think there are some really interesting regulatory affairs jobs around. For example, let's say you are working regulatory affairs for a high GHG emitter, greenhouse gas emitter in Ontario. Look at the challenge. I mean, look at the interesting things. I mean, how do you bring the company's GHG emissions down? How do you monitor and stay in touch with what governments are doing now, and more importantly, perhaps even what they're going to be doing? How do you prepare your company to adapt to those? How do you inform people within the organization what might be coming without being alarmist, but being factual and truthful about the presentation? All of these things can be quite exciting. Sometimes, we look at our jobs in a very kind of instrumental way, rather than looking at it as, this can be a really good opportunity, adventure, to learn something more and to move forward. So it's important sometimes, like I say, when we're caught up in the COVID-19s and we're caught up in the details of each individual course and trying to get our term papers done and everything, it's important to focus on, what you're applying for, what are the prospects, and once you land a co-op or you land a job, how best to learn as much as you can from that experience, and then build on it going forward. Okay? I often tell people that my career has been an interesting career from the point of view I've spent 20-some years traveling around the world advising governments and the UN and World Bank and Asian Development Bank and all that. Of course, I never planned all that to happen, but what I did do was try to see every job opportunity as a way of building bridges to other opportunities. And that's more than just taking your file that you're given and doing only what that narrow file provides, but rather using the opportunity to become a true expert in regulatory affairs across the product life cycle of the company, and building good contacts and relationships with regulators, a very important issue as well. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to wrap it up. We'll talk to you at the Zoom call this afternoon, and once we start up that call, like I say, that time is your time. You ask questions, I'm there. If you don't ask questions, there's no use wasting our time, and we'll end the call. If that's the full hour, great. If it's 5 minutes, so be it. All right? So we'll talk to you again later on this afternoon. Bye-bye now.